You're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Fresh Hell contains stories of a disturbing and often graphic nature and is intended for a mature audience. Please don't let your kids listen to this, or they might turn out like us. Welcome, I'm Annie.
And I'm Johanna.
And you're listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Thanks for tuning in this week.
To our international horror show.
Speaking of horror, did you hear about the latest German murder case? There was just an article where 3 people were killed with a crossbow.
I heard a little bit about it. I heard that something happened, but I'm not really well informed on that one yet. Do you know more about it?
It was at a boarding house in, is it Passau?
That's actually right at the Austrian border.
Oh, right. I didn't know that. But yeah, I don't have a lot of information, but they found 3 people, 3 bodies, and it looks like they were all killed with a crossbow.
Very Tyrion Lannister. It's a weird choice for a murder weapon.
I know, right? But well, no spoilers. These guys were shot in bed, though.
Okay, so they were shot with a crossbow. Do they already have a suspect?
I'm not really sure. From what I've read so far, it looks like maybe 2 of them asked the third person to shoot them because the police also found a will, and then it looks like the third person died by suicide after, but I need to look into it a little bit more. I just saw it right before we started recording.
Yeah, that sounds super sad. I might need to read a newspaper article about it. That's the problem, because did I tell you I gave up on reading the newspaper?
Oh, no, yeah, same. I've been totally avoiding most news outlets. It's just too stressful and it's awful lately.
I used to wake up every morning and spend an hour reading newspaper, with the coffee, and it just put me in such a negative and horrible mood starting the day like this. Now my husband, he tells me what's going on. He's my filter. He's my news filter.
That's good. It's good to have that. Mine still watches the news, and sometimes I'll just go in the other room and read a book. I still read a few newspapers, just not quite as often as I used to. Everything's kind of a bummer these days, but let's talk about something a little happier, like murder.
Well, today we have a really creepy story for you.
Yeah, this is one of those stories it's so bizarre, and it's really gruesome, you guys. And this is one that it stays with you for a while. So today we are going to talk about the very brutal murder of 2 people and about the 2 people that were responsible for those murders, the Papin sisters.
I remember the first time I heard about this case. I went to see a play by a very special acting group. They usually only work at the university and act for medical and psychology students. Once in a blue moon, these actors, they do a similar thing for a theater audience, and this one time they did the Papin case. I can tell you I was immediately hooked.
Yeah, I can't remember the first time I heard about this one, but I know it was a while ago. But I think we should warn our listeners that this one, we often will talk about, graphic things and gory things, but this one is really bad. It has all the bad things. So you've been warned, but not the death of a child. So at least we have that going for us this week. Johanna, you want to start with the background?
All right, let's dive into it. Christine Papin was born on 8th of March 1905 in Le Mans, France. She was the second daughter of Clémence Dare and Gustave Papin. And we can say one thing, that right from the start, the sisters Papin, they didn't have the best life. Clémence, the mother, was rumored to have an affair with her employer, but when she found out that she was pregnant, Gustave Papin offered to marry Clémence. He loved her and she was pregnant and needed a husband, so he stepped up, and only 5 months after the wedding, she gave birth to their first daughter, Emilia. Gustave, he was looking around, seeking employment in another city, and he found it, and he told his wife they were going to move. But Clémence, she didn't want to move. She wanted to stay in Le Mans, where her employer was close by. So she declared she would rather commit suicide than to leave Le Mans. They stayed. But as you can imagine, the marriage was rather doomed from that day on. Gustave, he started drinking heavily, and when Emilia was only 9 years old, it was discovered that he had raped her.
Yeah, so that's awful. And what's worse is that when this happened, Clémence, we would say Clemence here, but I'm going to do my best to get this right. So their mother, Clémence, who didn't have a motherly bone in her entire body, blamed Emilia, saying she had seduced her own father. And let's remember that we are talking about a 9-year-old child here. So Clémence sends her daughter to the Bon Pasteur Catholic orphanage, where she eventually became a nun. Good for her. Meanwhile, in 1905, their second daughter, Christine, was born. Gustave and Clémence gave Christine to Gustave's sister to raise, and she lived very happily for the first 7 years of her life. At the age of 7, and we're not sure why, but at the age of 7, she also entered the Bon Pasteur Catholic orphanage, where she also decided she wanted to become a nun. But unfortunately, Clémence strictly forbade Christine from doing that.
And we can only speculate about her reasons, but it seems rather mean in my opinion. My guess is that Christine would have not been able to earn money to help and support her family otherwise.
I agree. It seems Clémence didn't actually want to raise her children, but she expected them to support her financially. She's great. The convent the girls were sent to, it had a reputation for being pretty harsh and difficult, but they were taught cooking, cleaning, sewing, and basically all of the usual drudgery women were expected to take care of. Thanks to her Cinderella-like childhood, Christine was later on described as an excellent cook and a very hard worker, but at times she could be rather rebellious, and she really didn't like to take orders.
And anyway, if Christine would have ended up as a nun, we wouldn't have a story today to tell you. Leah, Christine's younger sister, was born in 1911, and just like Christine, she was handed over to Gustave's relatives where she lived until her uncle died. She also had a very happy life there, and she too then went to live at the Bon Pasteur until the age of 15, when she started to work as a maid too. Leah was described as shy, introverted and very, very quiet. But unlike Christine, she was very obedient and never questioned any orders she was given. People considered Leah to be the less intelligent of the two sisters. Later on, Leah and Christine usually tried to find a place of employment together and worked in quite a few houses in Le Mans as live-in maids.
Yeah, I had read that their mother would often find them different jobs to try to make more money, and then she'd demand they take them, so they ended up changing jobs a lot. But I guess that after their abusive and loveless upbringing, they definitely found comfort being close to each other. And they certainly formed, well, let's just say they formed a unique bond. I read a few things that implied people thought they communicated telepathically because I guess they'd spend a lot of time together looking at each other in certain ways but never actually speaking. But you do wonder if that's just part of the influence of living in a convent. Anyhow, in 1926, the two sisters once more found a place of employment for the both of them together. They began to live and work at the Rue Bruyère with the Lancelot family. And we have a photo of the exterior of the house, and as always, we'll post all the photos on Instagram and Facebook.
What do we need to know about the family Lasler? Well, that was René Lasler and his wife Leonie, and they had two daughters. While the oldest daughter was already married and out of the house, the younger one, Geneviève, still lived at home with her parents. Christine was employed as a cook, and she had gotten her sister Leah a job as maid at the Rue Bruyère house. In the beginning, all seemed well. Friends of the family Lasler later on reported the maids were always treated well, earned for that time appropriate wages, and they were even eating the same food as the family themselves. And I know it sounds weird if I put the emphasis on that, but that was not something that was usual in these kind of employments.
No, you'd never get the same food that the people who were employing you had. But yeah, they were treated very well, and they shared a room, but it was a really nice room. It even had its own balcony, which, again, totally unheard of for staff at the time. And when Madame Lancelot had learned that the girls were sending all of their wages to their mother, she was furious. She demanded that they keep that hard-earned money for themselves, and she sent a very strongly worded letter to Clémence, letting her know that the girls would not be sending her money anymore. I believe it was around this time that both girls started to call their employer Maman, so they called her Mom.
So as far as we know, the girls were treated well in the Laslar household, but also Madame Laslar definitely can be considered a demanding boss. She would often communicate her order through handwritten notes and also sometimes randomly put on white gloves and run her fingers across the surfaces, to see if the maids had been cleaning well enough.
Don't do that at my house. You'll ruin all your gloves.
We have dogs. If she found the work to be lacking, she would punish the girls, normally by shortening their wages, later on even pinching them whenever they did something wrong. And while I think that most of Madame Leonie's demands were not out of the ordinary for that time, I'd have to say pinching, it's a bit too much.
Oh yeah, no pinching, please. It was the evening of February 2nd, Groundhog Day, also a Thursday. Madame Léonie and her daughter Geneviève had been out shopping, and they were supposed to meet René Lancelot for dinner at Léonie's brother's house. The family was expected to return very late that evening, but Madame Léonie and her daughter Geneviève arrived home sooner than expected, probably to freshen up for their dinner invitation. They found a dark house, all the lights were out, and outside it was pouring rain. Christine greeted them on the staircase of the upper floor of the Lancelot home and explained to them that the power outage had been caused by her plugging in a faulty iron. Now, the sisters had just picked up the iron from the repair store that day because it had a history of wiring problems. And as the sisters weren't expecting their employers to return home so soon, they decided not to fix the fuse right away. When Madame Lancelot hears this, she raises her hand as if she's about to slap Christine, and that is when Christine snaps. A struggle between Christine and Madame Léonie ensues. Christine grabs a heavy pewter jug and hits her employer in the head. Geneviève, seeing this, runs to try to help her mother, but Christine attacks her as well, screaming, quote, "We will massacre them." Leia, who was resting in the maid's room up in the attic, hears this commotion and rushes downstairs. Seeing what was going on, she also starts to attack Madame Léonie, and Christine cheers her on, shouting, "Smash her head into the ground and tear her eyes out."
Meanwhile, the husband René Lancelot, he was waiting for his wife and the daughter at the house of his brother-in-law, but they didn't show up. After a while, he decided to return home to see what was going on, taking one of his friends with him. He arrived at the house at Rue Bruyère. Everything was dark and silent inside, and the only thing he could see was a faint light in the attic, like a single candle. He tried to unlock the door, but found it to be bolted from the inside. Unable to enter his house and worried about what had happened to his family, he made his way to the police station to report something was wrong. The police assumed that the house had been robbed and that the burglar quite possibly was still inside the Lancelot home because the doors were locked from the inside. When the officers arrived at the townhouse, they decided to climb a wall to the courtyard and try to make their way inside through the back entrance. Although the back door was locked too, a slight push opened it and the two officers started to inspect the dark and eerily quiet place. Downstairs, they found nothing unusual. As far as they could see with their flashlights, not a thing was out of order, and no one could be found on the ground floor. While making their way upstairs to the upper floor, they noticed something round and glistening on one of the stairs. At first, they thought it was a big marble, but when they take a closer look, they shrink back in horror, because what they find on the floor is not a marble, but an eyeball. They take René outside and don't allow him in, and then they climb the last few steps to the upper floor, where they find the bloody, beaten, mutilated bodies of Léonie and Geneviève Lancelot. And this is honestly one of the worst crime scenes we know of, so...
You've been warned. So both women had been stabbed and beaten. Their bodies were absolutely covered in wounds, and their faces were completely unrecognizable. Both women had their eyes torn out. Madame Léonie had a scarf around her neck, and in the folds of the scarf, they found her eyes. Genevieve's eye, there was one on the staircase, but the other eyeball was found underneath her body. There were teeth and brains all over the place. It was a complete bloodbath. So, thinking this was all the work of an intruder, the police thought that the Papin sisters, Christine and Leia, had probably met the same terrible fate, and the officers braced themselves when they made their way up to the attic. There, they found the door to the maid's room was locked from the inside. So they started to knock on the door, but nobody answered, and so they called for a locksmith to come and get the door open. But when the police finally got into that room, they did not find what they were expecting. They didn't find two mutilated bodies. Instead, they found the two sisters very much alive, lying together. I've seen it both ways. They were either naked or in bathrobes, but either way, they're together in bed. They're holding onto each other tightly, and on one chair in the corner of the room, there's a bloody hammer with hair still stuck to it. Questioned by the police, Christine immediately confessed to killing Madame Lancelot and her daughter. Leia only said, quote, "I am deaf and dumb," end quote, and wouldn't say anything more. They were placed under arrest and interrogated. When asked what they did to the two Lancelot women, Christine replied, quote, "They wanted to hit me, so I got my own back. It was either us or them. I would rather do my masters in than let them do us in," end quote. And little by little, the police learn what had happened that evening. And it's bad because, as we said earlier, when Leonie came home to find the lights out and raised a hand to strike Christine, she fought back with what I think we can all agree was an overreaction to an unexpected slap.
Definitely an overreaction. As we said, when Leah had heard the noise from the struggle on the first floor, she had rushed down from her room in the attic and she started to attack Leonie Lasselin. Christine had yelled, "Smash her head into the ground and tear her eyes out." And so they did. They gouged Madame Leonie's and Genevieve's eyes out with their bare hands. And now, without their eyes, Leonie and Genevieve were left helpless, unable to fight their attackers or even run away. Meanwhile, Christine had rushed downstairs into the kitchen to get a knife and a hammer, and with their new weapons, the sisters continued their attack, stabbing the women repeatedly, smashing their heads with the hammer. I think the whole ordeal must have taken around 30 minutes.
Yeah, I read in a few places also that it seems like they really took their time. They took turns passing various weapons back and forth as they absolutely brutalized the bodies of their employers.
Once the mother and the daughter were dead, the maids lifted up the victims' skirts, pulled down their underwear, and they actually started to cut into their thighs and buttocks. Genevieve's body was facing down. Next to her right hip lay a bloody kitchen knife with a dark handle. Blood covered the entire scene and had even splattered to the walls 2 meters above the bodies. In a last humiliating, gruesome act, they used Genevieve's menstrual blood and they smeared it all over the bodies, just as if they were basting a roast.
Well, she was known as being an excellent cook. You do wonder, though, if this was all part of it, because the way the two women were cut, it was like slices were cut out of them.
Yeah.
And then basting her, because she was a cook and she was the cook, you just wonder if that was all kind of part of the madness.
Well, I guess that was muscle memory. Like she was cutting meat probably so often that's the way she used to cut things, you know what I mean?
Exactly. Yeah.
I think it was to humiliate them.
I'm
Definitely.
sure. Yeah.
And there are photos from the crime scenes, and obviously we're going to post them. But did you read that the investigators, when they came to the scene, they pulled down the skirts a little bit because they couldn't photograph them like that?
Exactly. Yeah, because initially their skirts were, their genitals were on display, and there's no way that, God forbid, you look at a vagina. I mean, brains, no problem, but just keep those skirts down, ladies. It really is awful, though.
Yeah. When you looked at the photos from our Hinterkaifeck crime scene, where you can't see anything, and then you compare it to this crime scene photos, it's like different ball game.
Next level crime scene. So be warned.
So when they were done, Christine and Leah locked every door in the house, they lit a candle, they cleaned themselves up, and they went to bed. And there they waited for the police to show up. And Christine actually ends her statement with the words, "I have no regrets. I did not plan my crime. I had no hatred towards them, but I do not accept the gesture that Madame Lasselin had towards me tonight." A few days after the murder, the funeral of Leonie and Genevieve takes place, and thousands follow the procession. And thousands more line the streets of Le Mans to pay their respect.
2 hearses were used to lead the procession. When I say hearse, though, I'm really talking more about a cortège. So don't think car followed by a limo, which is what I think most people think when they imagine a funeral procession with a hearse. Think horses pulling your coffin on a carriage, Evita style, Princess Diana style. Annie style. So one of them was all black with black horses, and the horses were draped in black, and that's the standard tradition. But the second one was all in white with white horses because Genevieve was still a young woman. It's incredibly dramatic, and it's really a heartbreaking image, which we'll share so that you can see it.
So if that's Annie style, would your horses be black or white?
Both. I don't mind what color. Probably black, like my soul. I don't mind, though.
You would have to have it like our emperor used to have it when they died. They had one single white horse following the coffin because that was the horse that now didn't have somebody riding it anymore. Yeah.
Oh, God, that makes me want to cry, that poor horse. All right.
Christine and Leah were placed into prison, separated from each other. And this separation from her sister caused Christine so much distress. She started to act out violently. As a result, prison officials gave in and they allowed a short meeting between the two sisters. I can only imagine how much she was acting out, that they were like, okay, we're gonna give
Yeah.
in now. Yeah. And when they finally see each other again, Christine throws herself at her and starts to unbutton her sister's blouse, all the while pleading and begging, please, please say yes.
It's so bizarre. So time went by and the sisters' mental health deteriorated. One day in July 1933, Christine had a psychotic episode in which she tried to gouge out her own eyes. Unfortunately, the only way to stop her was to place her into a straitjacket. She then reported that on the day of the murder, she had suffered from a similar episode and that this was what made her murder the Lancelot women. 3 doctors were appointed to evaluate the mental state of the Papin sisters, and even though there were medical reports of mental illness in the Papin family, the experts deemed the 2 sisters to be sane and not suffering from any kind of mental disorder, which seems,
Yeah, they were not quite right. Let's say it like this. Now that you talk about it, I start to think, I don't know, what's your opinion? Do you think that Christine and Leah had a sexual relationship? Because it does sound like it, but I don't know, I somehow doubt it. To me, it looks as if Christine was more devoted to Leah than the other way around, and as if she felt that she had to protect Leah and therefore developed deep feelings.
I'm honestly not sure. I know that's a really popular theory that comes up in a lot of articles you read about the case, but we also read that the doctors reported that Christine's affection and love for her sister was just of a family nature, and they hadn't detected any kind of sexual context within their relationship. It's just so hard to know what was really happening with their history, of course. The case records for this case are sealed until 2033. So if we're still doing this then, we will update you when that happens.
Yeah, tune in 2033.
It's a date.
We're gonna be here. We're very happy because there are quite a few photos thanks to the huge interest of the French media. And if we look at the photos of the sisters that were taken before the murder and the photos that were taken after the trial or during the trial, to me it is as if we are looking at 2 completely different women. For me, it's not just the fact that they're all dressed up and have nicely done hair before. It's something in their eyes, but to be honest, I can't quite put my finger on it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they've got crazy eyes. You know crazy eyes when you see crazy eyes. I just think that they're in a really, really dark place here in terms of their mental health. The trial took place in Le Mans, and media attention was huge, and I mean really huge. For months, journalists presented every detail to the curious crowd, and when the trial began, the spectators were expecting 2 very seductive and dangerous and mysterious women. And yet, what the crowd was presented with, they were disappointed in, because when they saw the Papin sisters, they were completely the opposite. Christine was in a long beige coat with a neat bun, and she just kept her eyes lowered. Leah was in a dark coat with a similar prim hairdo, and she looked very frightened and shy. During the trial, they scarcely moved, and they rarely answered with more than a yes or a no, which was barely audible, except for once when Christine answered, quote, I shouted to Leah, assassinate them, tear out their eyes, end quote. And again, when the judge asked, what did you do with the kitchen knife? And Christine quietly answered, quote, I made incisions, end quote. Ultimately, Christine takes on the full responsibility for the horrible crime, but she never really gives an explanation for the murder. Experts talk a lot about Christine's sanity, her average intelligence, and her lack of attachment to anyone other than her sister. They testify that Leah has below average IQ, but that she too seems to be incapable of showing any sign of emotion for anybody else but Christine. But the 3 court-appointed experts fail to disclose many details, such as the long documented history of mental illness in the family, or that the 2 sisters had shown signs of paranoia well before the murder.
Yeah, I read that they wrote a letter to the mayor of Le Mans telling that they feel followed and prosecuted. Did you hear about that?
No, I didn't see that.
Yeah, they showed some kind of paranoia, definitely. So to counter the prosecution, the defense attorneys who argue that the sisters suffer from insanity called the police headquarters doctor as a witness. And he highlights the immense contrast between the almost non-existent reason for the murder and the ferocity in which the attack took place. He says that the culprit is neither Christine nor Leah, but a third person. And you can imagine with this statement, the courtroom falls silent. He continues that the culprit, the third person who is responsible for the crime, is the identity that was formed by the sisters together. He closes by saying that he cannot with 100% certainty say that the maids acted in a moment of madness, but that nobody can say that they are normal.
Yeah, but the court still sees no reason for further examinations to delay the trial, which seems, I don't know, I just don't see how this is possible.
They just wanted to be they wanted it to be over and done with.
Exactly.
I guess.
I think it just comes down to they knew who had done it. They
Yeah.
had a rough idea of why they had done it, and they just didn't care
Yeah.
very much about it beyond that. In the end, it only took the jury 40 minutes to come to a verdict, which, I mean, that's fair enough if they did confess. Christine is sentenced to death by guillotine, as she was concluded to be the mastermind behind the murders. Leah faced a 10-year prison sentence. The court concluded that she had been completely consumed by her older sister, to a point where Leah's personality was nothing more than an extension of Christine's.
It was only after the trial that experts argued that the two sisters had suffered from what they called a folie à deux, a madness of two, or twin madness in English. This is a psychological syndrome in which delusions or hallucinations are transmitted from one person to another. In the DSM-4, the syndrome is now referred to as shared psychotic disorder. Usually the two individuals who suffer from the shared psychosis live very close to each other, like for example, a shared room. They have little to no interaction with other people. There are several subforms of this syndrome. One of those is the folie imposée, in which a dominant, or also called the primary person, forms a form as psychotic belief and transfers it to the acceptor, usually a more submissive person. If the two individuals are now placed into medical treatment separated from each other, and that's the interesting thing, the acceptor usually dissolves the psychotic disbelief automatically and needs no further medication. It is imaginable the raised hand that Madame Lasselin used against Christine was enough to trigger the violent rage caused by a psychosis that had already developed over quite some time in Christine. We know that Christine definitely dominated the relationship and that she was the one controlling Leah.
Yeah, folie à deux is pretty rare, but there have been a handful of other instances when it occurred, including a rather infamous one in May 2008, the case of twin sisters Ursula and Sabina Eriksson. They were Swedish sisters who were visiting the UK. They were on a bus to London when their bizarre behavior prompted the bus driver to refuse to let them back on the bus after a rest stop. They'd been carrying bags and acting strangely, and the bus driver wanted to look into the bags, but they refused, so he refused them entry back on the bus. The bus driver lets the manager of the rest stop know that he's leaving these two women, and she calls the police. When the police arrived, they spoke to the two sisters and initially decided that there was no problem, they weren't a threat, everything was fine. But then it got really strange because suddenly Ursula ran out directly onto the highway into the path of an oncoming truck. And so she's hit by a truck and has sustained very serious injuries. Her sister Sabina then immediately duplicated her twin sister's actions by running into the path of an oncoming car. She was also hit and hurt, but not quite as badly, and both sisters did survive with severe but non-life-threatening injuries. It was later said that Sabina Eriksson was a secondary sufferer of folie à deux, influenced by the presence or perceived presence of her twin sister Ursula, who was the primary. The crazy thing is there's video of all of this. It was sort of like a UK version of the show Cops being filmed at the time, and so they were on location and caught all of this on video. Sabina's injuries were a lot less serious, and so when she got out of the hospital, she runs into a kind man named Glenn Hollinshead. He found her wandering around and trying to find her sister, and he decided to take her in and help her out. Unfortunately, Sabina ended up killing Glenn, who was only trying to help her, stabbing him to death in his own home. It was awful.
I never heard about this story, but it's a horrible story, really.
Yeah, it's bad. And you can see the video of them. You can't even believe what you're watching, really, when you watch it, because they're standing on the side of the road and they just sprint right into the middle of a really busy motorway. It's crazy.
And that's a bad story for all of the involved.
Mm-hmm.
For the sisters, for the people driving the cars.
Oh, it's
just
awful.
minding their own business, and I think we should also mention that there is another theory out there. Nowadays, some experts think that Christine and Leah indeed had an incestuous relationship. It was in a time where homosexuality was still not only a huge taboo, but even punishable, and therefore that was a secret that the two sisters never wanted to be revealed. This theory says that on the evening of the murder, the two maids thought they had the house all to themselves. Christine, only dressed in her bathrobe, was on her way downstairs, quite possibly to fetch something from the kitchen, while Leah was still lying in bed in their room. Now, when Madame Lasla and her daughter come home unexpectedly, she saw Christine only dressed in her bathrobe and knew all of a sudden what had been going on in her house for the last years. I don't know why she made this conclusion, but that's how the theory goes. I mean, she could have been in her bathrobe for all kinds of reasons, but okay.
I'm in my bathrobe right now.
Yeah. And the sisters, now in a nervous rage, gouged their eyes out because they had finally seen the truth.
Well, that's very dramatic, and I think we can probably say that's the movie version of events. I mean, maybe we'll become wildly successful and we can launch our own television network with made-for-TV movies starring, your favorite washed-up stars from the 70s, 80s, and 90s, but it's all true crime, and we could call it Hallmark After Dark. Do you get the Hallmark Channel?
We don't have it here, but I often watch them online because I think they are great.
Right?
They always have a Hallmark movie, like always.
Oh, yeah. Hallmark After Dark. Tune in. Really, I mean, I agree. I think it's more likely that both of the girls just had a lot of really serious mental health issues. No small part, I'm sure, because of their childhoods, which were very loveless and very difficult. But I think more importantly, Christine especially had some very serious undiagnosed mental health problems that ended up coming to a violent end.
Christine's death sentence was later reduced to life imprisonment, but without her sister, she soon suffered from depression, starved herself, and she showed often fits of rage. She seemed to not be able to function without Leah and slowly wasted away, which I think is interesting because she was the dominant one. So in an attempt to get her the medical and psychological help she desperately needed, she was transferred to a mental institution in Rennes. I think it's quite progressive for the time that they still tried to get her help.
Yes.
But anyway, it was fruitless. She finally died of starvation on 18th of March in 1937. Leah, she received a 10-year hard labor sentence, was released in 1941 after serving only 8 years. She moved to Nantes, where she was joined by her mother Clémence. Isn't that nice? Leah assumed a fake identity and found employment as a hotel maid. And I think that must have been so difficult to take on a fake identity and just vanish, because at the time of the trial, her face was all over the newspaper stands in France. I think to this day, this is still one of the most notorious crimes in France. And I heard it's apparently the only one that involves eye gouging.
That's a fun statistic. Tune in. This is the kind of quality information you're going to learn here. It's the only crime in France with a highlighted feature of eye gouging. You're welcome.
That's the most horrible part. I mean, everything is horrible, but the eye gouging, that's so... You remember that movie, Chien Andalou, from Louis Buñuel, where they cut the eye with the razor blade?
No. What are you talking about?
Louis Buñuel also made a movie, the Andalusian Dog or something like this.
Yes.
Showed where they cut the eyeball with the razor blade.
Yes,
I think people are very sensitive about their eyes, and that's why the eye gouging is so horrible.
It's awful. I know. I think of Kubrick in Clockwork Orange when he's got his eyes.
Yeah, same.
Yeah. Eyes are, just leave the eyes. It's just, I bet you're going to think about that the next time you're eating grapes. Takes a lot more than that to bother me, but I would struggle the idea of pulling someone's eyeball out with my bare hands. Although I was reading something recently, I've been keeping this in the back of my mind, and I thought about it when we did this case. I was reading about some case where a woman was being attacked, like she was going to her car at night and she was attacked, and she actually went right for the guy's eye and ripped his eye like out of the socket, and he took off. And I was like, that's pretty smart. I mean,
yeah, you should do that. My husband tells me all the time. He always tells me how I should defend my, he's a soldier. He does this kind of. And he always tells me, go for the eyes. Just sit back and, go for the eyes. And you need them.
Yeah, you do. So, all right. So we don't know the exact date of Leah Papin's death, but a photo of her did surface at one point that's supposed to show her as an old lady. While some people think that Leah probably passed away in 1982, there's a French film producer who claimed in his documentary that was called In Search of the Papin Sisters, and that came out in the year 2000. And in it, he claimed he had found Leah Papin and that she was supposedly living in a hospice. This woman, who claimed to be the lost Papin sister, had suffered from a stroke that left her mostly paralyzed and unable to speak, and she eventually passed away in 2001. She apparently had a lot of old photos, so many people believe it might have been her, but we don't know. And regardless, she did assume a new name and lived the rest of her life out quietly.
This case also had a huge impact on the French intellectuals like, Jean-Paul Sartre, Georges Genet, Claude Chabrol, or of course Simone de Beauvoir. And they saw in the murder of Leonie and Geneviève Lasla a rebellion of the working class against their masters who mistreated them and tried to oppress and exploit them. They were viewed as victims of the class war, held as slaves by privileged nouveau riche. And this crime inspired countless books, plays, and movies. And to this day, it shocks and fascinates many people around the world. And you can check it out. There is, for example, the play The Maids or Les Bonnes by Jean Genet that I just mentioned. And this play was made into a movie. It was made into an opera. Then there is the movie The Murderous Maids from the year 2000, I think, and it's supposed to be a very accurate movie about it, but there's much, much more.
Yeah, and class warfare was just such a huge issue at the time. I wish we could say it's a thing of the past, but we all know it's still a problem.
It's always about class, I think. That's it. That's the terrible story of the Papin sisters and the murder of Leonie and Geneviève Lasla.
Yeah, it really is just so, it's awful, isn't it? So let's end on a slightly happier note. Tell me something good. Come on, tell me something happy. Seriously, though, tell me something good. Are you reading or watching anything lately that you would recommend?
I was watching a lot of true crime documentaries during the last days. I was watching Mommy, Dad, and Dearest. I was watching The Cheshire Murders and Beware the Slender Man.
Oh, yeah. Beware the Slender Man is very disturbing.
It's very disturbing. It's unbelievable, actually. And
Mm-hmm.
also the Cheshire Murders. Wow.
Yeah. In Cheshire, Connecticut?
Yeah.
Yeah. That's also very, very bad. I haven't watched, have you watched the Netflix Ted Bundy movie yet?
No, not yet.
No, me neither.
Not yet. Maybe I'm gonna do that tonight.
Yeah. All my spare time now I'm doing this. Yeah, it's all good. I just finished rereading one of my favorite book series, the Kate Daniels series. It's written by a husband and wife team, Ilona Andrews, and it's a book series that I've read over and over again. Do you ever have a series of books like that where you open a book and it feels like you're just spending time with an old friend?
Yes, I do.
Nice.
It's Harry Potter.
Yes.
I'm one of those Potterheads. So thanks again for listening to the Fresh Hell podcast. Like always, we'll post everything on social media. Please rate, review, subscribe, send us a message with some suggestions. And also, Annie has made a new group where we can discuss all things true crime.
Yeah, so join our Facebook group. Tell us your thoughts. And as always, if you're going through hell,
keep going. Tschüss.
Bye.